Welcome to Cyber Savvy. This podcast was created by DTC to bring awareness, mitigation, and response to cybersecurity threats companies and organizations face daily. Be prepared. Be cyber savvy. All right. Well, good morning. This is Andrew Rose, and welcome to Cyber Savvy. I am sitting here outside of the the triangular place where North Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee meet. And I am so excited today to have two guests, Monica Smith and Andrew Rose, who you may have recalled from earlier podcast. And today we're going to be discussing just culture. And this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And I hope that this gets broadcast wildly across the country and across the world. But before we start, I'd like to do a round of introductions. And Andrew, why don't you let us know who you are, who you work for, and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I am the Chief Security Officer for an organization called SoSafe. And SoSafe is actually a leader in human risk management. So this is about driving past awareness, past behavior and culture, and actually starting to put guardrails around people's behavior within organizations. So it's something I'm quite passionate about because I believe firmly that from my cybersecurity background, that actually people are the area where you can make the greatest improvement in terms of your cybersecurity risk for your enterprises. And that perspective has been informed by me being a chief security officer for many years in different organizations. So I was the chief security officer for two of the biggest global law firms for about 10 years. I was the chief security officer at MasterCard in the UK and also looked after UK air traffic control, which is where I first stumbled into just culture, which came into our conversation. And I've also did about 5 years as a Forrester analyst as well, covering the role of the CISO and the security awareness and behavior and culture piece as well. So I've been in the industry for a little while, always focusing on security and with a special interest recently in that human aspect.
Oh, wonderful. And Monica, you have a title of Chief Flourishing Officer. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I would love to hear more about who you are, what you do, and explain Flourishing Officer and what does a Flourishing Officer do?
Yes, so thank you, Chief Flourishing Officer. I have a couple of roles. So one is serving as Chief Flourishing Officer at DTC, where we provide a variety of full spectrum technology services, managed services to a variety of industries, dental being one major one, but not the only one, certainly. And the title, the choice of focusing on flourishing was very intentional because we are trying to create, the definition of flourishing is healthy, vigorous growth, particularly as a result of a favorable environment. So we have a really strong commitment and intention to constant growth, improvement, excellence. And we know that in order to really create that, the foundation has to include a favorable environment, which we'll get into today, because a big part of the favorable environment is what is the culture that's really going to support that. So my role is helping to create and foster and continue a favorable environment here as part of the culture, and also focusing on continuous learning, mindset. We'll talk about psychological safety as well. And then also I have a private coaching practice called the Clear Mind Project. And there I focus a lot on addiction recovery, intimacy, connection, communication, well-being, and resilience. And I have great opportunities. I'm very, very grateful and fortunate to be able to infuse a lot of that in my work here at DTC.
Phenomenal. One of the things that I focus a lot on are the future risks. And being in cybersecurity, for me, that's what they call right of boom, after the attack has occurred. And then you start thinking about what are some of the ways that we could have mitigated this attack. Right now, I think it's the majority of cybersecurity attacks start with the social engineering angle. They find a key employee, they build personas, they reach out to that employee, whether it's through finance or sometimes it's a press, sometimes it's a job offering or what have you. But a lot of us are not prepared for an AI-enabled persona to approach us and interact with us in a certain way. And earlier this year, I pulled together a small private group to discuss what are some ways that we can mitigate against these social engineered AI attacks. And Andrew brought up this brilliant idea of just culture. And for me, it was kind of like finding the best book in the library and never knowing it existed when he brought that topic up. But Andrew, you mentioned earlier that you'd worked with the airline industry, and that's where you first became aware of just culture. Can you just talk a little bit about when you first found out about just culture and some of the early days in just culture, and maybe even give us a macro understanding of what just culture is?
So it's very much aligned in my experience with safety culture. The analogy that I always used was basically an example of an engineer working on a jet engine on a passenger aircraft. And if that engineer makes a mistake and drops a bolt into the engine, then they have two choices. The first choice is they have to go to their boss and they say, right, we have to take everybody off the plane. We have to take that plane out of circulation. We have to take that jet engine off the wing. We have to rebuild it. That plane is going to be out of service for a couple of weeks. All the passenger flights today are going to be messed up. It's going to cost us a couple of £1 million to sort this out. That's option number one. That's a really hard conversation to go to your boss and say, I have just screwed up royally and really messed it up. Problem is that option number two is that you don't say anything. You just stay quiet and you hope it's fine. And you hope that the little bolt has made its way through the engine. It'll just fall out and nothing will happen. But obviously there's massive risks associated with that option. But that's the easier one for the engineer to go for. So we have to actively encourage them to have those tough conversations because you want safety above everything else. And if that means that we have to face up to the mistakes that people make, it's fine. I'd rather have that than we'd have the safety outcome, the unsafe outcome. So that became clear to me when I joined air traffic control because safety was so paramount and it was above everything else. We have to be safe. And so people were encouraged to speak up. People were really encouraged to participate and to say when they'd made errors. And yes, there was a thorough process to actually investigate the problems that had come up and the errors that were made. But it was very much done in an environment of no blame and of them being engaged in the whole process. So the person who'd made the mistake felt that they could improve the processes that were within the organization. And you see that a lot. You saw that there were processes in place that had been put in place because of previous lessons that we'd had. And we had to make sure that we never lost those. And if ever processes were going to change, we had to go through and review, like, why is this process here? What value is it giving us? Because we put it here for a reason. And we mustn't forget that even though that process has been in place for 20, 30 years, we mustn't forget that it's probably there for a good reason. So it sort of came up in pretty much every conversation I had across air traffic control. But it became quite clear to me that it related so perfectly to cybersecurity. And so I started to use as we started to tie cybersecurity and safety together, then I very much embraced Just Culture as part of my security culture as well.
Good. You touched on a few things there. I love the institutional knowledge. Why is this process here? Because I think a lot of times we forget why we do certain things. So, Monica, I know you've spent quite a bit of time delving through the Just Culture. And before I chime in, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on how applicable this is to organizations. This is a complete change from the credit blame system and currency that we're so accustomed to. What are your thoughts?
Yes, thanks, Andrew. I did, when you brought it to my attention, the term, I mean, certainly I'm engaged in a lot of culture work, but the term itself, I did research to try to make some connections. And the big piece is, one of the definitions I loved that I saw was it's a self-improving system created by trust and safety, right? And that kind of gets to what you're talking about, Andrew, of obviously creating not only the foundation of safety, which allows people to speak up, but then what can happen from that is a system that is focused on self-improvement, right? It kind of takes care of itself. So some of the big elements that stood out to me of kind of other concepts that apply to this are psychological safety. There's some research out there, one being a really famous study by Google, Project Aristotle, where they studied, I think, 180 some of their teams to try to figure out what is it that makes the best team. And after trying all kinds of configurations, personality, IQ, technical skills, they realized that the who never mattered. The who of the right configurations of the humans and their intelligence or their personality didn't matter. What mattered was how they interacted. And the most innovative teams, the most high-performing, innovative, creative teams really just had a foundation of safety for interpersonal risk-taking without fear of blame, right? So really, I think there is this movement to focus more on not so much just individual performance or individual accountability, but team-based performance, accountability, safety. One of the things from a psychological safety model perspective, Timothy Clark has a book that talks about these 4 parts of safety: inclusion safety, learning safety, contributor safety, and challenger safety. And I think kind of I can see, Andrew, tying into what you're sharing, one of the things he says is the need for acceptance precedes the need to be heard. So again, it goes back to that foundation. Are we creating a foundation where it is safe to speak up? We are focused more on continuous improvement and learning together as a group. And then when that is there and we're learning, then we feel like we're actually contributing and we feel safe to actually challenge or bring up when we make a mistake or we see a mistake that somebody else made, but maybe even having the safety to bring that up. So really it comes down to me to emotional intelligence trumps IQ. And we see that consistently in the research, right? We're never going to avoid that because we're wired for connection and we're wired to be tribal.
You touched on a couple of really good points there, Monica. In fact, I wasn't writing fast enough to take my notes down.
I know, sorry, I talk fast sometimes. I got to slow down.
That was perfect. One of the things when I was doing my research on just culture, there's just culture and there's reporting culture. And it seems that we need to implement the just culture piece before we get to the reporting piece. Yeah. Andrew, what is your experience with that? I mean, have you gone into an organization where this has been introduced and you've watched the tranches and tiers move up, or have you just been in organizations where this was already a practice?
I guess rather fortunately, I've been into organizations where it's already been pretty established. But I see from my work with other CISOs, when they're trying to implement security within their enterprises, that too often they see that path to a solution is to introduce penalties for people making mistakes. And I have a whole conversation thread about consequence management, but too frequently I see CISOs go, right, well, if we just punish them, if they click on 3 links in an 18-month period, then they'll learn their lessons and they won't do it again. And that just is very, very counterproductive. It just proves that you as the security guy are the bad cop. You're not going to get people engaging with you. You're not going to get people working with you and being honest about issues that they've made, problems that they've caused. If they do click on a link, they're going to try and hide it from you. Whereas really what you want is you want them to tell you straight away, because then you can actually act upon it. If they've made a mistake, if they've introduced malware into your enterprise, you need to know as soon as you possibly can. You don't want to have to find out about it 18 months later when the whole network is gone. So I do constantly talk to CISOs about avoiding that path and avoiding that blame culture, because it just doesn't work. But the problem is there's always a fear in the staff that you talk to. There's always a fear that they will be blamed, that there will be some stigma about coming forward. So I do see that just culture has to be very clearly communicated to people as the culture of the enterprise, of the organization that we're going to embrace. And then that can encourage people to step forward. It would still take a little while for people to get confidence in the process and see that the first people who've reported it have not been hung out to dry and not been punished in any way. And they can start to see that system and process improvements are filtering back through the lessons learned process at the end of this. But I think once that starts to be seen, then the whole organization starts to get confidence that, oh my God, absolutely, everyone's on board with this. It becomes that definition you said, Monica, about the self-improving system based on trust. That's exactly what you can build. But you do have to be very clear that just culture is something we're embracing, and we're not going to shoot the messenger. We encourage you to come forward because we can learn from what you've done. And I think another part of it is also to recognize the cyber threat landscape, because as was alluded to earlier, attackers do not care what sort of technology you have at all. They don't care if you've got the latest firewall, latest anti-malware, any system. It doesn't care. What they care about are the people in your organization. And you constantly hear people talk about how people are your weakest link or your first line of defense, whatever they are. I think the best way to think about it is people are your primary attack surface. That's where the attackers are looking to exploit. They're looking to break in, steal credentials, and log on as trusted members of staff. And so they do that by targeting the people in your enterprise. So you are going to get a lot of events. You're going to get a lot of attacks that involve people. So by putting a just culture out there, you're helping turn up your sensitivity to those issues, to those attacks, and improve your human sensor network effectively, because people will alert you as soon as they see anything suspicious, and they won't feel the need to hide it because they're at fault in some way. So there's definitely a path forward for this, but I think going forward and saying just culture is what we're embracing here is the primary aspect of it.
So Monica, if you were one of our dental clients sitting listening to this podcast right now and you're curious about just culture, what are some basic ideas or some basic thoughts that you would have for them, some direction and what have you?
Well, so one of the things, this is sort of a roundabout answer to your question, because I think it is important. It's something I've seen come up and kind of to follow on Andrew's concept of the blame. I think that just culturally, societally, maybe even there is this fear that if there isn't blame, there isn't accountability, that we associate blame and accountability as the same thing, and they're really not, right? And so I think it's important to make it clear that removing the fear of blame is not having less accountability, right? So it's actually, again, I'll throw some resources out. Mike Irwin, who does a lot of leadership writing, talks about how accountability works better inside of a strong relationship. So this is actually more of a macro system accountability, making it safer to hold ourselves and each other accountable. And another resource, Mary Lee Adams has what's called a choice map. This is out there. Anybody can Google choice map. And the whole concept is the difference between asking the question, whose fault is it? And asking what happened and what can we learn from this takes you on two completely different paths. And it really is elevating from a person-centered approach to a process-centered approach. So as a client, or really as any organization, I would say this is really a path to ensuring identifying risks sooner, getting to the root cause of issues rather than putting a Band-Aid on things. This safety also could allow a team or an organization to dig into a deeper root cause of something bigger that might be going on. So the more trust and safety there is inside of an organization, the more trust and safety an organization can provide to its clients, right? Because as within, so without, and vice versa, right? Whatever's going on inside of an organization in terms of the relationships, that flows out. So quicker identification, trust and safety flowing out. I think that that's a piece of reassurance, hopefully, and really thinking macro versus micro, process versus person. I think it's going to be necessary to combat, Andrew, all the things you're talking about that are really out there, and probably will continue.
I think it's interesting you mentioned about accountability, because there can be a perception that Just Culture does let people off the hook and that they can just go and do what they want to do and they won't get blamed for it. And so they'll just go and do bad things. That's not the case. There are still processes within the flow of Just Culture to say, okay, was this intentional non-compliance? Was this a reckless act that you did? Was it intentional malicious harm that you did to our network? And if it wasn't, did you do this because you were too tired, or you were taking performance impacting drugs, or doing something that you shouldn't have been doing? So there's still a flow within this, which means that people can be accountable. And there's a logic process in there too, which says, there's the substitution test, it's called. And it says, would somebody else in your position, with the education that you've been given about this, make a similar choice? And if we come to the conclusion that yes, they would, then it's okay. This is not your problem then. You wouldn't. This is our problem. We've designed our processes incorrectly. We've designed our systems incorrectly. We haven't given you the right tools or insights to manage this risk. So there's lots of gates within this, which do make sure that accountability still holds firm, and that people, if are doing things that are outside of the working processes, and they know that, and they're acting in a reckless way, then there is still accountability there.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think that's great. And it's interesting because, and I think there can be a misperception about removing blame removes accountability. I think also safety, the talk of psychological safety, I think gets a bad rep sometimes, because it gets perceived as just making people comfortable all the time. And in fact, to your example you gave in the beginning, it's the opposite of that, right? The most uncomfortable thing to do is to say, I made a mistake. I made a huge mistake. I messed up. This is a big risk for the organization. That's uncomfortable. And we're not going to do it unless we have the safety there as a foundation. And in doing some of the research about Just Culture, I happened to see this article out there. And it was, I think, a misinterpretation of psychological safety. And one of the things the author had said was, would you want somebody feeling comfortable when they're receiving a very negative performance review? And the answer is yes, because you want them to feel safe when they're having that hard conversation, because it's the only way anybody individually is going to get better. And it's the only way a team is going to get better and actually get stronger to combat some of these insane forces that are out there.
Yeah. There should be an element of reward in this, because, if people are making mistakes and you're learning from them, then you should be able to effectively pat them on the back and say, that it's the old light bulb thing about how, he found 10,000 ways not to make a light bulb, isn't it? We've just found another way not to make a light bulb. Excellent. Thank you. We can learn from this. We can grow from this. We won't make that mistake again. So I see that as a positive feedback loop. But It's a little counterintuitive, I guess, but I also see when people are non-compliant with policy as a feedback loop as well. I was chatting to a CISO friend a couple of years ago, probably now, and they were saying about how if they found people non-compliant with policy, that they would take action and discipline that person. And I was saying, no, this is the perfect feedback loop. If they're not following your policy, they're not following it for a reason. So find out what that reason is, and that tells you, something that you're missing in your organization. You're not giving them the right tools. You're not giving them the right process. Your process is too clunky. So it's a really good feedback loop. And unfortunately, mistakes like this do provide you with insight. So make sure that you pick up on every piece of value that you can get from this and learn everything you can from it. And that is something that feeds very much into the just culture sort of loop. And it can become a little troublesome, well, not troublesome, a little burdensome, should we say, that you do have to make sure that every mistake that happens, everything that's brought forward has a full investigation, that you learn as much as you can from that particular issue. And that involves bringing people together, sitting around, having a deep dive, lessons learned, which, is not the easiest thing to do every time. There's a lot of navel gazing and consideration of, okay, what could we do better and how could we add more process into this? And in certain agile organizations, they may see that as, why are we wasting time? Let's just get on and build the product. Let's just, make the next widget. So that's, I think, why you see just culture mainly in those safety culture organizations and those safety critical organizations and critical national infrastructure. That's where I predominantly see this. But there's so much value in it that I think CISOs and security leaders can embrace this process because the value they get from it is worthwhile.
Yeah, and I could see, I think to your point, that's how it's reinforced when those investments become a habit in an organization that we do after action reviews. We discuss lessons learned. We actually put those things into action. It reinforces that we're serious about that commitment.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree.
One of the pieces with a mature, just culture that really excites me is that it appears it develops a sense of community, that people within the organization look out for each other. They notice small behavioral changes and are able to address them because now we've created an environment where these things, it's enabled to do that. And Andrew, this gets back to the using the just culture as one of the mitigating effects against social engineered AI attacks, is that when we notice somebody is acting differently, we can bring it to either their attention or someone else's attention. Have you seen that within the organizations you're a part of or affiliated with?
Noticing people are acting differently and bringing it to attention. It's a tough one, and it's a tougher one these days ever since the remote working has become an issue. So you're sort of bringing the conversation back to sort of insider threats, really, and whether people have had their accounts compromised or whether people are acting suspiciously. And insider threat is a big topic with security leaders, but it's so much more difficult these days because you used to be able to see that, if Bob turned up for work and he was driving a brand new Ferrari, you go, oh, something in Bob's life has changed. Perhaps he's been getting paid off and he's now been stealing secrets and selling them to some other nation state. But these days, you don't get to spend as much time with your work colleagues anymore because most of the interactions are short and limited and on Zoom. And so actually, you don't get to see people's behaviors very much. You just get to interact with them in very sort of formalized little boxes. So I don't see that people really do comment on other people's sort of change of behavior too much. There are a growing number of user behavioral analytics tools that are out there, which are looking for deviations in people's behaviors. And that brings that to the security leaders' awareness. But again, those are not great because they lack so much context. People may change their behavior for any number of reasons that's nothing to do with security. And so if the UBA system identifies that somebody has started to change their working habits in some way, it doesn't necessarily mean that there was some sort of social engineering attack. It just could be their life has changed in some way. So they're difficult to implement too. Yeah, the whole sort of community piece and contextual piece around that is difficult. I don't think it drives a really terribly insightful way forward. There's one aspect of it, I guess, which I do find useful, which I discovered. And that's when I was asking about culture and trying to build up metrics around the culture in my organizations. I did find it was so much better to ask questions about what people thought their peers would do. So if I asked them and said, how likely are you to spot a phishing email? How likely are you to report an incident to the service desk if you caused a problem? They would get very high scores and go, absolutely, I'll spot these. Absolutely, I would report to the service desk. But actually, if you say, well, how likely are your peers to spot these? How likely are your peers and the people you work with likely to report this to the service desk? Then you get probably what I think is a lot more accurate of an answer, where they go, oh, well, yeah, I obviously would report it 10 times out of 10, but my colleagues, probably 6 or 7 times out of 10, they would report it. So actually, it's quite an insightful way to find out what the real culture temperature of your organization is by asking people what the people around them would do or think. That tends to come back with a little bit more of a realistic answer, I find.
Oh, I love that one too. And I think that kind of ties back into the element of reward. I really made a note of that piece of it too, because that was one part I was not thinking about. Monica, what are your impressions on that element of reward? Because that really, I think, rather than seeing heads on platters, seeing someone rewarded for doing something like that, that could really change things.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that without that piece of the reinforcement, whether through reward, appreciation, modeling, making these things a habit, I think it will not have as much of an impact to, especially if, and I mean, I can, all of our efforts to continue to grow our culture, that it's only successful to the extent that it's reinforced. And I think the rewarding of that is actually a big piece. And among some of the books I've read in terms of psychological safety and kind of implementing it at various levels, one of the examples that's given is NASA and Silicon Valley. They have what they call assigned dissent. So assigning dissent, like assigning it as a task that, like, okay, you three over here, your job is to actually peel this apart, right? It's to find weaknesses. It's to find where we're failing. It's to find the alternative as an assignment. So I think they've called them red teams or tiger teams, where that's their entire purpose. And that's a different way of rewarding it, right? Because you're telling them that that is the job for them to do. And it's a way to kind of start to bolster that safety and to create that culture where it's expected, it's celebrated, it's appreciated, it's just part of how we do business. So I think that between kind of making that more of a norm in the culture and also then rewarding when somebody, and I mean, we practice this a lot at DTC. If someone disagrees with our CEO, has a different perspective, that is celebrated. And it's okay to disagree. It's actually what we need to get better. We need to have dissenting opinions. So I think the rewarding it and appreciating is a big piece of it.
I think it is. It's interesting because that very much maps to the sort of de bono thinking hats, doesn't it? And wearing the black hat, and sort of someone takes on that role of being the person who asks the tough questions and is cynical about what's being put forward. So I completely agree. It's a good, positive thing to have. I do have to bring forward now that actually one of the negatives, if there is a negative about just culture, is it can become a bit of a barrier. Because by encouraging everybody in the organization to speak up and to have opinions, then what it can do is it can throw up lots of barriers to strategic growth and strategic moves forward. Because you'll find that people who are perhaps set in their ways, who've got a more antiquated view of how things should be progressing in the organization, will see a strategic plan come forward and they won't agree with it. So they will say, well, I don't agree. And because of just culture, my voice must be heard. And that can get in the way if that happens again and again. And you can find that strategic initiatives can be slowed down a little by this. So you have to have good management, which is able to sort those pieces out and actually say, yeah, I appreciate and I hear what you're saying and I take that seriously. However, we understand that threat. We've got that in place. We've got mitigating controls in place. We understand it might increase our overall risk in the enterprise a little more. However, again, we've documented that, we've quantified that, and we're happy with that. Therefore, let's move on. So you do need to think a little about that if you're going to start to introduce significant change in the organization, that people who aren't on board with it have got a vehicle to stop from the lowly position in the enterprise, to stop massive strategic moves forward just by raising their hand and raising their voice, and suddenly everything grinds to a halt until that can be dealt with. So that's one of the downsides of just culture, but again, it can be overcome.
Thank you, Andrew. I just want to follow on. I'm really glad you brought that up because it is one of the things that we talk about a lot here in terms of the pendulum swinging. Like, you learn a new concept or you're talking about something and then the pendulum goes all the way over here. And I completely agree and can see cases where, okay, now, so we're encouraging everyone to have a voice and now everyone always has a voice and we're not getting anything done or we're not moving forward, right? And so that really brings to mind to me this idea of polarities, right? Polarities are, and this was one of our skill buildings that we talked about recently, two seemingly opposing forces that it's not an either or, but a both and. It has to be managed, right? We have to find that sweet spot. So confrontation and unity, preserving and disrupting, right? These kind of two extremes. And as a culture, finding that balance of managing both of those extremes. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because everything has a swing too far, whatever it is.
Yeah, I've certainly been in situations where people disagreed with things I was wanting to achieve. And if we ended up in sort of mediation in the organization because they thought it was going to introduce too much risk, I thought it was the way forward, but they were able to step up and go, okay, well, I don't even work in your department, but I'm challenging what your strategy is because I don't agree with it. And it's like, okay, and you have to work through that. Just culture demands that you give them that airtime and you give that credibility. You can't just dismiss it. But you learn from that, and you start to learn what people are concerned about in the organization, and you can pick up on things that, okay, yeah, you're saying something here to me that I hadn't thought about, and so I can improve what I'm doing. But it can be a tad annoying at times, but I think you have to stick to the process because the benefits of just culture far outweigh these small bad points. So yeah, I'm still all for it, despite those sorts of drawbacks.
Yeah, not just plus discernment and boundaries and all of those things, all of those good things.
Going back to Monica, one of the things you said about the assigned dissenters, the folks that are going to the red team or tiger team your organization, are these people that sort of raise their hands and say, hey, I want to be this person? Or are these people that you have identified within the organization that you think, oh, these are always my contrarians, I would love to have them put that dark hat on and go from there? Is it a senior level person? Talk to me a little about that and how that would apply maybe at DTC or one of our healthcare clients.
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't know the quote correct answer or how these other, I don't know how NASA or Silicon Valley does it, but what I could say here, if we were to be, experimenting with that, one of the things that we try to really focus on here is that it's not just a leadership voice, right? In fact, people that are boots on the ground have so much insight and so many gems to pull out that often get missed, whether that because they're not speaking up or because we're not giving them a place. And so what I might actually experiment with, if somebody is already a strong dissenting voice on their own, I might actually experimenting with bringing the opportunity for some of those that don't feel as vocal or that don't have the opportunity as much to do that, to actually sit in that role and giving them permission to do that. Because what we want is more voices. And kind of going back to the Aristotle study about all of those teams, one of the pieces that they found behaviorally was balance of conversation. So the teams that had more conversational equity, meaning voices getting the same general amount of airtime in a team, that was actually a factor that built safety. So it wasn't this dynamic where one or two people dominated the entire conversation, but that team just generally had a balance of all the voices. So I would actually be looking for those that maybe tend to speak up less and empowering them to be the dissenting voice for a while. And Andrew, I don't know if you have a different perspective or experience.
No, I think that makes entirely good sense. I'm just thinking back to my experience, and unfortunately, I'm not sure this is common or not, but those dissenters will speak up regardless. So encouraging them to speak up, you don't need to do that. Right. They're going to be raising their hands and getting involved, whether you want them to or not. So giving them the black hat to wear is not going to help. But I think giving the black hat to other people to question it will give them confidence. Will give them confidence to sort of talk and to put themselves forward. But yeah, those dissenters, again, that I've experienced tend to be the same people most of the time, and they do tend to be relatively junior in the ladder, but honestly hugely experienced, hugely insightful, but perhaps with a different perspective than that leadership perspective. They do see the nuts and the bolts and the processes very much right there in front of them, and so they bring a different angle to you as a strategic leader who thinks about in terms of business goals. They are very much seeing that in the terms of the process, in terms of what we got to do next. This is where the issues are. That's where I find most of my dissenters were in that sort of area, really.
Yeah, and I think, Andrew, to your point, in terms of still requiring that sort of strong leadership in the sense of the ability to hear all of those perspectives and create a space for it and still make the best strategic decision that needs to be made. And From my perspective, the commitment to all of the employees in an organization is it's not so much that I'm going to promise you I'm going to make a decision you like, but I'm going to promise you're going to know the why. I'm going to promise transparency about the why and how it fits into what we're trying to achieve as an organization. And that's a commitment we can always honor. So it's a balance, creating the space, creating that as a norm, and then still being able to kind of see through all of that. What's the ultimate mission and make the decision we need to make.
I think that's a positive thing in itself, isn't it? It just makes you communicate better with your team and with your organization. Therefore, it's driving a more open culture. It's driving more psychological safety. It's driving all the good things that you want. So again, another good benefit from the process, really.
Andrew, I have a question for you. The organizations you've worked at that have had a just culture in place, what does the onboarding process look like? Because I'm sure that's going to be a foreign concept to a lot of folks. And then I imagine once people embrace it, that could be a positive on the recruiting side as well.
I guess, you know what? I don't think they actually really made a big deal of it. It was just the way we work here. It was very much just culturally accepted. That was what it was. I don't think it was even really called out to me when I joined the organization. It wasn't highlighted as a benefit. It was just, that was just the norm. So I don't think there was any particular induction process. But as you joined one of the teams, it would become apparent very rapidly that you were listened to, you had influence, you had a voice, that you were encouraged to report any issues or any concerns that you had, and people would take you seriously and not blame you. You would see that around you, would see people acting in that way. So I don't remember any educational process about that. Perhaps there was. Perhaps there was, because obviously I was working as a security leader in that space, and perhaps in the engineering department, perhaps they made a bigger deal of people being onboarded and being taught these things. But actually, I didn't see that from my perspective. But it becomes very clear very quickly that there is empowerment there, there is trust there, that people are encouraged to speak up. So it filters through pretty rapidly. But again, I don't see them using that as a sales point. They don't try and recruit based on just culture. It's just the fabric of who they are. They don't see it as special. They just, I think probably if you took somebody out of a safety culture organization and put them into a financial services organization, they'd probably be horrified at how the culture just wasn't supporting them. It's like, what you mean I can't speak up? I can't talk about this? What? So I think there's just an expectation that it's there.
And Monica, I loved your earlier quote about as inside is also outside. People, you can tell when someone enjoys what they're doing, who they're servicing, and that leads through to the clients and the customers. Not necessarily a question here so much as more your perspective is. Once a just culture has been implemented in an organization, and now you're starting to see that the glow and the spillover and the ripple effect that goes beyond that. Can you talk a bit more about that? Just really the positive psychological feelings that people have when they're working in one of those organizations and how that bleeds through.
Yeah, I think that kind of to follow on to what Andrew was describing of that, what you're describing, Andrew, sounds like a very mature, it's like it's embedded, right? So meaning that it doesn't even need to be spoken. And one of the things that, it reminds me of, we watch more than we listen as humans, right? Like words matter, but at the end of the day, we're watching what's being modeled, and that's what we're absorbing more than anything else. And so kind of to your point, and when we're coming into a very mature organization where that is the norm, it's going to just get picked up. But what that tells me is that the values and the behaviors of that organization are real. They're being embodied. And then, Andrew, to your point, that flows out because emotions and energy are contagious. So we can't help it. Whether we can try or not, we can't help it. And so if that is what it feels like inside of a tribe, a team, an organization, it is going to be contagious outward. And I think that in terms of the kinds of customers and clients that are attracted to that organization, that stay in that organization, and then how that grows. And the hope would be that in some small way, whatever those interactions are with clients, that whether it's for a day and one interaction, it carries maybe into that office between two employees there, or between them and their patient, in our case, a dental office and their patients. But I think sometimes we can underestimate those little interactions, micro moments of connection, but they can carry through in big ways. So hopefully that does flow outward. I think that it does. I think that whatever we have going on inside an organization is what we're putting out.
I agree. Having worked in Forrester and done a lot of evaluations of different companies and different industries, it was interesting that one particular industry I reviewed, all these organizations trying to differentiate themselves and prove why they were better and deserved a better score in our Forrester Wave. And actually, the only true differentiator of these organizations was their personality. And those personality sort of flowed out to me in those interviews and those discussions. And actually, I was able to really feel the difference between the organizations when all the other metrics were showing them as pretty equal. I could point at an organization and go, this organization just wants your money. This organization really wants a challenge. This organization is really flexible and friendly and really wants to work with you. And it was interesting facets that was unquantifiable and very difficult to put in the report really without being challenged, but very much made an impression on me that I could point at those organizations and describe them to you, having never worked there, because the personality flowed out in those conversations, which is really unexpected, but interesting to see.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I think it's so easy to forget that all this stuff is just like, again, way back in the day when we lived in the wild. I mean, it was a death sentence to be an outcast from the tribe. We needed to connect in order to survive, like quite literally, right? And so we still have this wiring to read each other and to read that energy and to feel that in ways that I think we forget. We're doing it all the time. As you said, you can walk into a room and feel the energy of that room. You can feel the personality of a team. And we're doing that with these intuitive kind of tribal senses and wiring that we still have, our original operating system we're still walking around with. And I don't think we think about it as often as we could, but we read it all the time. So I don't think we can help it. We can't avoid it even if we try.
And I love your comment. I'm writing down all your great quotes here, the micro moments of connectivity, and that kind of getting to the heart of it, we're creating a community. We're creating a community that cares about each other, that looks out for each other, and then makes the organization itself a lot stronger as well. Now, Andrew, you've spent years studying this, or at least had years of exposure to the just culture. What are some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves as we think about the just culture?
Questions to ask. I guess it's really about how you're going to implement this in your organization, I think, because there's a lot of structure out there to be found about how just culture works. And one of the things I just want to make sure that people understand, and I might come back to this when we wrap up, is the fact that we've been talking about this for a while, and it might sound like just culture is actually quite a big, complicated thing to put in place, but it's not. It's really simple. It's a really simple model that's just got lots of value and it's really easy to do. So don't be off put by the fact that we've rabbited on about it for a long time. It's actually really simple and really valuable. So certainly sort of look to embrace this, but start to think about putting in place a sort of a process, the process to go through and start to say, well, okay, if something happens, how do I go through the thought process? How do I think about, was this a deliberate act? If not, did they have sufficient training? If not, did a similar peer do in this case? Is something to blame in the process? Is there something in the tooling that we've given them that is to blame? Start to sort of put together a little flow chart of your questions, because that's one of the things you'll need to do. And there's lots of them out there on the internet, just putting in sort of just culture, I think just culture flow chart or decision tree into Google. And you'll find many people have done this already, and you can start to leverage all that. So I think that's an important thing to do. I think you have to make sure that what's the limits of your scope for this? Are you just doing this for cybersecurity, or is this a wider scope for your whole enterprise? Because that's going to be a bigger deal. So you have to get your board and your exec bought into this. Do they want this to just be limited to cyber reporting, or is this for every engineering aspect, for every healthcare aspect as well? Which honestly, I would suggest is a good idea, but be clear on your scope before you start to push this out, because it's a significant change to the ways of working. It's a significant cultural shift. So if this is going to be your whole company's culture, it needs to be embraced and communicated properly from the top down, and the people at the top need to buy into it, because it can cause, as we mentioned earlier, a little bit more friction in terms of strategic growth. So that's a couple of things I would think of, but you don't need to boil the ocean. You can just start to put very simple things in place, just deciding that your team will never shoot the messenger. And if anyone reports anything to you, you will go to them and say, okay, that's terrible, isn't it? Let us sort this out for you. And let's see what I can learn from this. Even just doing something as simple as that with your reporting process will start to change the temperature in your organization. It'll start to create feedback loops back to people in the department which go, oh, I did report one and they were quite friendly about it and they helped me out and they gave me some advice and told me what to do so I can avoid this next time. And actually it was fine. They were friendly about it. Even things like that will make a difference. So every interaction is an opportunity to build a culture. So take, embrace that, but decide what your scale is. Are you going everything top down or just a small thing within cybersecurity?
That is a fantastic answer, because I get so hyper focused just on the cybersecurity aspects of it and kind of lose the larger picture of the organizational changes. And the way you describe it here, it's just interconnected circles that ripple outwards that are just even more better and beneficial for the organization itself. Monica, I'm sure you've got about 4 or 5 pages of notes there that you
I
haven't
do.
even touched yet. So
It's
I'm going
true.
to turn the microphone over to you and let you chat for a little bit.
Yes, I think it was a great call out by Andrew in terms of really figuring out first kind of how big or small do you want to go with this? Because there's just layer upon layer, and it is an investment. It's a different way of thinking. It does require an investment of energy, time, again, modeling reinforcement. And I think it can be simple. I love just don't shoot the messenger, just rolling that out as a principle and then demonstrating it, right? And I think along those lines, just looking at opportunities, especially for leaders and how they're going to model that. So it would be powerful for a leader to share a situation where they made a mistake, and to just own that up front, model the safety first to kind of open up those conversations. It kind of reminds me of Kim Scott, her radical candor model. She talks about when you're practicing encouraging upward feedback from a direct report or an employee, and you're asking them, what feedback do you have for me as a leader? And of course, that's a very difficult question, right? It's uncomfortable. And one of the things Kim suggests is start by telling them what you need to work on. Just get the ball rolling. Well, here's one thing I already know about myself, right? That can help kind of model, like, it's okay. I'm a human. I can be aware of my own humility. So I think just looking for, what are we trying to achieve? Micro or macro level, and then how can I start reinforcing it and modeling it myself? I think there are a lot of very simple things that can be done. And then Andrew, I was taking notes as you were talking. It was a great question of what questions to ask. I was like, "Ooh, that's a good one." And one of the things that came to my mind was, what is our relationship to discomfort as a team or as an organization? How do I see us addressing discomfort as a culture right now? What do we do? Like, is it talked about? Do I see people getting uncomfortable or not? Right. So again, there's little things, and I think the bigger things is if it's a macro level commitment to just overall getting to a place of excellence, then you're talking about values, and can people articulate them, or do we see them modeled? Can we talk about when they're not being modeled? Right. So I think, again, lots of directions to go, and agree, doesn't have to be overwhelming at all. Can be a lot of small things that make a big difference.
Just to jump on top of that to talk about the reinforcing piece, because that reminded me of another sort of lesson I've learned in my career, which is that top-down messaging doesn't tend to work very well, that I found.
Mhm.
It's a bit like, I use the analogy of trickle-down economics, which, where you give the richest people tax cuts and therefore everyone will be richer because it'll all trickle down. And it never does. It trickles down a tiny bit and stops. And I
Yep.
think exec messaging in organizations is very similar. So
Yep.
one of the techniques I found to be very effective at changing a culture is actually starting to embrace middle out messaging and finding people of different roles across the organization and getting them to be my voice as a security leader, using them to talk about the messages that I wanted to get out. Because that starts to create a sort of level of perceived peer pressure. People start to think, oh my God, well, Bob in accounts, he believes this. He thinks that security is important. And I know Bob and I like him, so perhaps I should take it more seriously too. So I found that basically creating a communication plan which positions other people from around the organization as the voice of that is so much more effective. And if you could use, as you said, stories about middle managers making mistakes or reporting issues and the feedback they got and the lessons they learned and the support they received and how it has a positive outcome, that's so much better than just getting your chief exec to send an email out to everybody going, "We're now adopted just culture, you'll be fine, talk about it." That's not going to convince anybody. You need to keep that communication plan moving forward for quite a while and keep on bringing it from different perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's great. Having change agents is huge because I completely agree. Just blasting an email from leadership that this is now what we're doing is absolutely not gonna reinforce anything for sure.
Well, good. I have run out of questions here, but Andrew, you mentioned that you had a few things that you wanted to opine upon as we get close to the end of this podcast.
Well, only really the fact that this is something that is not as scary as perhaps we've made it out to be. It's not such a big thing. It can be implemented in a small way to make big differences. So I am regularly surprised that people don't know of Just Culture. So go and have a look on the internet because there's a lot about it. And I found a very good process from the National Health Service in the UK, where they've actually given a flow chart about how to think about incidents, how to think about problems. Andrew, I'll send you a link for that flow chart, but it helps people go through about, was this a deliberate piece of harm? Was the person acting because of mental ill health or physical ill health or substance abuse and they made a poor choice? Did they have foresight of what might happen? Would somebody in the same skill set with the same education know about this? And it gives you a really very clear flowchart to think about this. And especially with any healthcare people who are listening to this, it's very applicable to their ways of working, really applicable to their culture. So I'll give you that link to perhaps put in the notes so people can see that. But it is just a case of building your scope and then starting to think about how you deploy this because it's so relevant to so many industries. With cybersecurity becoming such a big deal these days, every organization is a technology enterprise. Every organization is completely dependent on technology to deliver on their value proposition. And this gives you the best human sensor network you can possibly have. It enables your sensors to actually speak up about any incident that they have. And that's exactly what you want to encourage as a CISO. You don't want people to be scared of punishment. You don't want people to be scared of speaking up. You don't want people to just think, oh, it could be a problem, but I won't mention it because I don't want to trouble anybody. That's the antithesis of what you want. So Just Culture really gives you a path to get to this. And it just makes it a really nice place to work as well, generally. With the one or two little sort of foibles that we've talked about, the one or two pieces of friction that does create, they're worth it in the long run. Mm-hmm. So definitely investigate this for your organization.
And Monica, again, taking some notes there of your wonderful quotes. What is our relationship to discomfort? That for me is just another topic for another podcast, but I love how you brought that up because I think as wonderful as Just Culture is, there will be that little bit of friction there. It's a different system. I'm not sure how widely embraced it is in the UK. I know it's not completely embraced here in the US, but it's going to be an entirely different mindset from the way people have been hardwired to think about their organization. What last closing thoughts do you have about this as well?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think that's a big message. I definitely want to constantly take every opportunity I can to put out, whether it's Just Culture or psychological safety. It is actually more about resilience than it is about making everybody feel good all the time. It's the opposite of that, right? And I think that just as Andrew said, doesn't have to sound as complicated as it might have in some of this discussion. There are a lot of great resources and even small ways to start. And Andrew, I'm happy to provide you some resources that I know of as well. Just the power of asking different questions, finding a team meeting and asking a question you wouldn't have normally asked. And I think there's so many ways, big and small, to make an impact. So I think it is worth looking into and investing in. I think that just between what's going on with our world today, including all of the cybersecurity risks, but even beyond that, this is going to become more important than ever. This idea of kind of getting back to our tribal roots and understanding that none of us have escaped that all of these years. I think we're going to actually come back around to how critical that is to be successful in kind of what we're walking into.
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd say is that I think Just Culture is about looking for risk, not looking to account blame. I think that's
exactly
the one thing you should keep in mind about the whole thing. It's looking for new ways to make sure people bring risks to your attention. I think that's the one line I put about it.
I love that.
Well, fantastic. Well, I appreciate Andrew you joining us from London, and Monica, I appreciate you joining us from Baltimore. And I'm out here in Tennessee, about to cross over to the Georgia state line, then over into North Carolina a little bit. So this is quite a wide net that we've cast here for our podcast today. Along the lines of Just Culture, I do want to certainly tout DTC and our expertise and what we do. And the reason we have someone like Monica Smith, who is our Chief Flourishing Officer, to ensure that not only do our clients' IT systems run appropriately, but that our people and our clients are taken care of, heard, and appreciated. And I can't put Monica on a big enough pedestal to let everyone know how wonderful she is, but also how much she's done for this organization, because it has just been an incredible sea change what she's brought about. But anyway, thank you so much for joining us today. Looking forward to our next podcast. And Andrew and Monica, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much to you both. I appreciate it.
Cheers. Thank you.
We would love to hear from you. Please email us your questions or comments to askus@dtctoday.com. New episodes of Cyber Savvy are posted the second Tuesday of every month. For more detailed information, visit our website at dtctoday.com. Be prepared. Be cyber savvy.